Good afternoon and a very, very warm welcome on behalf of the Center for Policy Research. It's an absolute privilege for me as the president of the center to welcome all of you to today's inaugural lecture by Dr. Peter Varghese. This lecture series is the first of a series commemorating India's 75th anniversary of our independence, the Azadi Ka Mahotsav, which is our near 75-week celebration that started by the Government of India on the 12th of March 2021 and runs through to the 15th of August 2023 to celebrate and commemorate our independence, our history, our people, our culture. As part of the celebrations, the Government of India, in collaboration with research institutions, academic institutions, private institutions, public institutions, have all come together to organize a wide range of events. At CPR, we thought we would take this opportunity to celebrate our independence and celebrate 75 years of our independence by learning from around the globe, from all those who've been part of our journey as an independent nation, as a nation that is playing an active role on the global stage, understanding how India's journey has been viewed by our friends, our partners, our supporters around the globe, what they understand of India's role in shaping global governance and shaping the world order. And in the context of the very dynamic changes that are underway across the globe, where India should position herself as she looks to the next 25 years to celebrate what the Government of India calls the Shatabdi Sankalp, the 100th year of our independence and our founding as a modern nation. It's an exciting moment for all of us as citizens of India to have this opportunity to celebrate our nation, to celebrate our founding fathers, to celebrate our constitution and the imagination and aspiration of what we had in 1947, to reflect and look back at the journey that we have taken, to ask ourselves important questions of who we are as a nation 75 years down the line and where our future pathways should take us. This is a moment for us to celebrate, but also a moment for us to reflect. And it's a huge honor and privilege for us to have you, Dr. Varghese, to join us today in this reflection and in this celebration as the inaugural lecturer in our series titled India and the World, how India has engaged with the globe and how the globe views India over these 75 years. So thank you very, very much for agreeing to be the inaugural speaker for this lecture. You've had a very long history of partnership with India, but also, if I may say, with the Center for Policy Research. And it's a real privilege to be able to welcome you back to our Zoom room. I hope very soon we'll be able to welcome you back to our premises in India. I'm also privileged to invite our member of our executive committee and senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, Ambassador Shyam Saran, who's one of the most distinguished members of CPR's faculty, who will chair this discussion, the lecture today. So I'm going to hand over to you, Ambassador Saran. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today and really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Peter. It's always a pleasure to see you, even if it's not physically at the moment. I will just make a short introduction for the benefit of our viewers. Of course, you have a very long and distinguished curriculum in front of me, but I will just highlight some important aspects of your very distinguished career. Peter began as Chancellor of the University of Queensland in July 2016 and is now serving his second term in that capacity. But what is perhaps very important for us is Peter's very extensive career in public service and diplomacy, stretching over almost 40 years, I would say. Senior positions in foreign affairs, in trade policy, intelligence, And most recently, he served as the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade from about 2012 to 2016. But for us, most importantly, he was one of the most successful and perhaps one of the most popular Australian High Commissioners in India, where he served from 2009 to 2012. Of course, he has had other diplomatic assignments, High Commissioner to Malaysia, and also he has served, in the Prime Minister's office in Australia. Very importantly, Peter was also the author of a very comprehensive India economic strategy, taking us to 2035. What could be the trajectory of India-Australia relations. This was actually commissioned by the Prime Minister of Australia himself, and this report was made available in July 2018. So that's a short, curriculum of Peter. I will not go into many other details, but what is important for us is to get a perspective on India-Australia relations and how Australia sees the role of India, both in the region as well as globally, at a time of really tumultuous change. Virtually, in fact, the world seems to be changing by the hour, as it were. And we are faced with a very difficult crisis taking place in Europe. A very long-standing partner of India, Russia, is very much in the thick of it. And it is also a time where our relations with the United States of America, with countries like Australia, Japan has also been, expanding. So you can perhaps realize that this is a somewhat challenging situation for India. And in this kind of situation, to have a perspective from someone like Peter, who has been very much and very closely associated with India at the highest levels, who has a familiarity with India perhaps very few diplomats have, to get a sense from him as to how he sees India's journey so far. Also a very, 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 very challenging journey, and what may lie in store, taking into account the situation that we face. So with those few words, let me once again extend a very warm welcome to Peter. And Peter, now you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Shyam, for that generous introduction. And let me begin by thanking Yamini for the invitation to deliver this lecture. I'm only sorry I can't do it in person, but I'm very delighted to be associated with this initiative. From my time as High Commissioner now, almost a decade ago, I've had a deep admiration for the Centre for Policy Research and the contribution that you have made and continue to make to discussion of the big issues in public policy. And Shyam, I do want to record a debt of gratitude to you, because we've known each other for a long time, for your wise counsel and your penetrating analysis that's helped fill at least some of the very many gaps in my understanding of India. So at 75, most people are reflecting on the past, weighing their achievements and perhaps wondering what might have been. For India at 75, however, the larger questions are probably about its future. Will it deliver on the economic potential that has always seemed around the corner? What type of strategic power will it be? Will its social cohesion hold and its extraordinarily secular, liberal and democratic character continue to define it? India, I think, defies categorical judgments, and whenever you think you're close to understanding it, some contradictory evidence will emerge. So qualifications and caveats intrude on the most elegant and uncluttered conclusions. And so it is with the observations that I will be making. They offer a personal and external perspective anchored in an affection for India, tempered by the scale of the challenges India faces, and inevitably incomplete in its understanding of a complex society, a raucous polity, and a distinctive economy. I feel a very strong connection to India, and I speak as a friend who wishes it every success. India was the birthplace of my parents. It has sat blurred in the background of my upbringing. I've served there as an Australian diplomat, bringing Australian eyes to a relationship which has been variously overlooked, sometimes oversold, often underdone, but always shaped by an expectation of better things to come. India's greatest achievement of the last 75 years has, in my view, been to build a secular liberal democracy. At its midnight hour birth, many wondered how a nation of such extraordinary diversity could remain united. Its choice of democracy is all the more extraordinary when you consider how widespread poverty and illiteracy were in 1947. India could have been forgiven for insisting then that it could not afford the indulgence of democracy, that its development challenges should not be distracted by the slow and elaborate compromises that inevitably come with democratic government, that leadership should be in the hands of the educated few, not the gift of the people. Instead, it crafted a constitution anchored in the principle of the sovereignty of the people, written by leaders every bit as inspiring and sophisticated in their drafting debates as the authors of the We the People Constitution of the United States, and buttressed by the institutions and principles which shape and uphold the rule of law. And nor was this an intellectually derivative exercise. It was a constitution written by Indians, for Indians, and for an Indian polity and community with distinctive challenges and conditions. Nations rarely evolve in a straight line. Their internal achievements ebb and flow. Their policies change. And so it has been with the India of the last 75 years. In its early decades, India's leaders were attracted to both Gandhian ideas of self-sufficiency and a Fabian socialism, which put a premium on industry plans and regulation. In the 90s, it moved in a different direction, dismantling the license Raj, giving more room to market forces, and opening up the Indian economy to foreign investment and foreign trade. India's strategic policy has also changed over time, from the less than balanced non-alignment during the Cold War to what is today a posture anchored in strategic autonomy, but much more expansive in its willingness to work with the United States and its allies, and I'll have more to say on that later. India at 75 faces three big challenges. First, can it find the political will to articulate and pursue the larger market-based economic reforms which can position it to take full advantage of its assets in a more uncertain global economic and geopolitical environment? Second, will it be able to insulate its policy on strategic autonomy from the pressures to side more closely with one side of an emerging strategic equilibrium centered on balancing and constraining China and now Russia? And third, will the secular, liberal, democratic character of India hold? So let me start with the economy, because in my view, this will be the single most important determinant of India's future. What we are seeing in the Indian economy is the playing out of some deep structural drivers which give it momentum. But this built-in momentum alone will not deliver the growth rates that India needs to lift its standard of living and provide employment for its young demographic. It will also need structural economic reforms. If India doesn't get the economy right, it cannot acquire the strategic heft to play the broader strategic role which it and countries like Australia wanted to play. The Indian economy, of course, needs to be understood in its own terms. It'll always march to its own tune. It is the only country with the scale to match China, but it will not be the next China. Indeed, comparisons with China only get in the way of understanding the singularity of the Indian economy and the nature of the opportunities in the Indian market. No Indian government will be able to direct the economy in the way China does, nor will it ever have control over the allocation of resources, which has been intrinsic to China's economic success. China has a discipline to its economic planning, which flows from its one-party political system and the competence of its state institutions. Also, for all its diversity, China has a strong Han Chinese core, which has no counterpart in the linguistic and cultural diversity of India. Nor will India's economic model mirror that of East Asia more broadly. India's economic model is and will remain sui generis. Its growth will be driven by consumption and services and less so by exports and manufacturing, and it'll be anchored in myriad small and medium-sized enterprises. The drivers of Indian growth are structural, which suggests to me they're also sustainable. They include the urbanization of the world's largest rural population, the gradual movement of the informal economy, accounting for some 80% of India's workers, into the formal economy, a young demographic with a mean age of 28, considerable investment in infrastructure, the absence of which has in the past held back growth, and the beginnings of an ambitious program to upskill 400 million Indians. These structural drivers will likely keep India on a relatively strong growth path, perhaps in the order of 6 to 8% a year over the medium term. And there I'm assuming incremental rather than radical structural reforms. COVID has slowed this trajectory by a few years, and even before COVID, the Indian economy had slowed significantly. But COVID has neither stopped nor reversed the broader trends in the Indian economy. This year, growth is likely to be strong, although whether it is V-shaped or K-shaped is an open question. But while India has some strong structural drivers of growth, it is also the case that more structural reforms are essential if India is to move from potential to delivery. Now, India doesn't need any tuition on what form these reforms should take, and certainly not from outsiders. The reform agenda has been part of the Indian economic debate for decades and includes reform of the banking system, access to land, labor market rigidities, a skills deficit, deregulation, privatization, and state capacity. How to do this in an argumentative and robust democracy such as India is a matter for India, but it will require a significant investment of political capital. Economic reform is never easy in any country, and there will always be constituencies who will oppose it. How much political capital to invest in economic reforms versus other issues will be a question challenging India's political leadership for decades to come. Historically, India's political culture has favored those who advocate state intervention and state subsidies. Elections are rarely won on a platform of market reforms. Calls for structural economic reforms tend to come more from academic economists, business figures, and editorial writers than from political parties. Good economic policy in India is generally not good politics. India has, however, shown in the past that when it must, it can deliver on economic reforms. In the last 4 decades, India's per capita income has quadrupled, and over 200 million people have been lifted out of absolute poverty, largely as a result of changes to economic policy. The lesson of India's economic history is that the more it opens up its economy, internally and externally, the stronger its economic performance. This is the background against which India's well-wishers will view concepts such as self-reliance. Self-reliance is, of course, a virtue, but a risk is that it can slide into self-sufficiency, which is a failed economic policy everywhere. Economic sovereignty has made a comeback everywhere in the post-COVID era, but COVID hasn't changed the laws of economic gravity. It hasn't obliterated comparative advantage in trade or the economic benefits from the efficient allocation of domestic resources by the market. We, and here I very much include Australia, should keep this firmly in mind when we discuss concepts such as self-reliance, resilient supply chains, dual circulation, decoupling, and so on. The post-COVID focus on security of supply chains opens up new opportunities for India because India is high on everyone's diversification strategy. Those who worry about an over-reliance on Chinese supply chains tend to see India as an obvious and desirable substitute. But if India is to act on these opportunities, it will need to do all it can to increase the attractiveness of India as a place in which to invest and do business. Ease of doing business is one element, and this is an area where India has made a lot of progress in the last few years. But even more important are inputs such as infrastructure, regulatory certainty, a sound financial system, and access to skills. And fundamental to India's economic success is strengthening the capacity of the state to design and implement the right policies. The competence and resilience of institutions lie at the heart of this challenge. Let me now turn to India as a geopolitical partner, because we live in an age of geoeconomics, and some of these trends present India with large new opportunities. China's abandonment of hide and bide, its ambition to become the predominant power in the Indo-Pacific, if not beyond, its use of economic coercion, and its desire to recreate the Middle Kingdom, where harmony was hierarchy with China at the top, all of this is leading other countries to balance and constrain China. And India is seen as an important element in these strategies. So while India will always march to its own strategic tune and cherish its strategic autonomy, the scope for us to work together on the broader challenges of the Indo-Pacific is growing, as is India's willingness to work in the Quad together with the US, Japan, and Australia in ways which capture the growing strategic convergence of these four democracies. Now, the Quad is not a grand anti-China military alliance in the making. It is not an Asian NATO, even if it is likely to see more military cooperation among the four countries. Indeed, India is allergic to the very idea of alliances. Rather, in my view, the Quad is a means of managing China's ambitions in a way which puts some constraints on how far it is prepared and allowed to go. It signals that leverage can be a two-way street. Of course, to exercise leverage, the Quad will have to do more than meet and issue communiques in support of the peaceful resolution of disputes, the upholding of international law, and the eschewing of coercion. It'll have to be prepared to make it clear that it is willing to impose costs on China for unacceptable behavior. These costs might range from diplomatic through to economic, all the way to collective measures to uphold principles such as freedom of navigation and the law of the sea. It is this capacity to exercise leverage which will ultimately determine the success of the Quad, rather than what it does collectively in areas such as infrastructure, climate change, or pandemic responses, important as all of those issues are. Each member of the Quad brings a different perspective and motivation to its dealings with China. For the US, it is a means of helping blunt China's ambitions for predominance and reinforcing the absolute determination of the US to stay number one. For Japan and India, both of which carry historical baggage when it comes to China, it is a shared concern that a predominant China will narrow their strategic options and room for maneuver. The one member of the Quad for whom the core issue is the character of the Chinese system is probably Australia. Indeed, Australia is perhaps the only member of the Quad whose anxieties about China would likely disappear if China were a liberal democracy. After all, what would be the basis of our concern in those circumstances? Australia doesn't have any in-principle objection to the concept of a predominant power in our region, quite the contrary. We have historically seen US strategic predominance as the bedrock of our security and also as the great enabler of economic growth in Asia. The US may speak the language of a new ideological Cold War, but the reality is it is driven more by its determination to hold on to strategic primacy than a battle against an authoritarian system. The US would be, in my view, just as determined to remain number one if China were a liberal democracy. And neither India nor Japan, I would suggest, for reasons of history and geography, would be at ease with a democratic China as the predominant power in the Indo-Pacific. We may be in the same Quad bed, but we each have very different dreams. So the Quad is one way of moving from the no longer tenable hope for the best engagement with China to a more realistic engage and constrain framework. It is saying to China that we want a relationship of mutual benefit, but we also want China to pursue its interests in a way which respects the sovereignty of others and avoids coercion. And if China behaves otherwise, there will be collective pushback from countries which are capable of effectively doing so. Constraining China will take time to construct. It is unlikely the Quad will ever reach the NATO-like point where an attack on one is considered an attack on all. Nor is the Quad likely collectively to rush to the assistance of a member which may be the target of Chinese economic coercion. If anything, some Quad members may benefit from such coercion in that the restriction of imports from one Quad member may create export opportunities for another Quad member. But while the Quad may not have the unity of approach for hard-edged collective action, China's behavior is pushing the Quad in this direction. It is also shifting perceptions beyond the Quad as more countries see with discomfort what an assertive China looks like. This has both hastened the urgency of pursuing arrangements such as the Quad and AUKUS and reduced the caution about offending China. China currently seems determined to behave in ways which are quickly losing its friends and respect. Polling shows this is evident across the globe, with negative sentiment about China rising substantially. Yet China seems not to care. This is either the arrogance of a nation which believes that its time has come and it can do as it pleases, or it reflects an essentially internal dynamic where the party sees domestic advantage in adopting a strongly nationalist position, irrespective of the diplomatic costs. I suppose all of us who have worked as professional diplomats have learned that domestic considerations beat foreign policy most of the time. Indeed, what makes the management of relations with China so complicated is that these days on all sides, domestic compulsions loom large. While the currents of geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific are moving India closer to the US and its allies such as Australia, they are very unlikely to move so far as to cause India to review its embrace of strategic autonomy. Can India sustain this balancing act at a time when constructing a new strategic equilibrium aimed at constraining China and now also Russia is at the heart of US policy in the region? India's relationship with Russia complicates its position of both embracing the Quad to balance China on the one hand and insisting on its strategic autonomy vis-a-vis Russia on the other. Walking a fine line on Russia and Ukraine is one example. India's abstention in the Security Council and the rather tortured wordplay which accompanied it disappointed many. India's friends understand absolutely the history of its relationship with Russia and the consular obligation it owes to Indian students in the Ukraine. But since respect for sovereignty and the principle of non-interference are foundational principles of Indian foreign policy, there was an expectation that their blatant violation would be explicitly called out. Those who want India to give up on strategic autonomy and pick a side will likely be disappointed. But India must itself realize that strategic autonomy is not the same as keeping all your options open all the time. If strategic autonomy is to mean anything, it must also involve making hard strategic choices. These tensions in India's position will only get more complicated as the China-Russia relationship evolves into a joint effort to balance the United States. The China-Russia relationship may not be a formal alliance, but it is now more than an opportunistic coupling. It is a response to groupings such as the Quad and AUKUS, and whatever strategic suspicions Russia and China may still harbor about the other, they are today more prepared than in the past to put them to one side in order jointly to weaken leadership and the US-led alliance system. India's close defense relationship with Russia now effectively means that the strategic partner of its adversary is both India's largest arms supplier and the adversary of arguably India's most important strategic partner of the future, namely the United States. Put simply, how will India resolve the tension inherent in working with the US to constrain China while China works with Russia to constrain the US? The point here is not that there is a risk of India parting ways with the Quad or walking back from its strategic relationships with the US, Japan, and Australia. Rather, in my view, it is that the tension inherent in India both opposing China and embracing Russia will have consequences for its other relationships. It means that the pace at which the Quad can move will be both slowed and determined by India's position. That doesn't make the Quad useless by any measure, but it does mean our expectations of it need to be realistic. Let me now turn to the bilateral Australia-India relationship and the ways in which it has been reshaped by economics and geopolitics. At the heart of our economic agenda is a structural complementarity between the Indian and Australian economies, which is the key to translating ambition into opportunities. Put simply, a growing Indian economy will need more of the things Australia is well placed to provide, from education services to resources and energy, from food to healthcare, from tourist destinations to expertise in water and environmental management. Indeed, services are likely to be the fastest growing segment of our future economic partnership with India. In 2018, as Shyam mentioned, I submitted a report to the Australian Prime Minister on an India economic strategy to 2035. I noted in that report that there was no market globally which offered more growth opportunities for Australia than India, and that we should set a goal to make India our third largest export market. I also urged that India be brought into the first tier of Australia's strategic relationships with people-to-people ties as close to any that we have in Asia. I think in the past 4 years, we have made much progress towards these ambitions. I won't go into the detail of the India economic strategy, but I will include some further material in the published version of this lecture. I want to just talk a little bit about our people-to-people connections, because in many ways, over time, this may prove to be the most important element in the bilateral relationship. India is currently our largest source of skilled migrants, our second largest source of international students, and at least up until COVID struck, a substantial proportion of those who come to Australia under temporary visas to fill skilled positions that Australians cannot. In the last decade, we have seen a very large increase in the size of the Indian diaspora in Australia, now over 700,000 strong, and the fastest growing large diaspora in Australia. To reach this size in a little over a decade is quite remarkable. This diaspora will have a big role to play in the partnership of the future. They can go into the nooks and crannies of a relationship where governments cannot. They can shape perceptions in a way governments cannot, and they create personal links in business, the arts, education, and civil society which can help anchor the relationship. This is a diaspora which is also likely to exert a growing influence on Australian politics, something which is already evident in our state government politics. As they have in Canada, the UK, the US, and elsewhere, the Indian diaspora may prove over the next 2 decades to be the most politically active of any migrant group in Australian history since the Irish. This will have positive implications for the priority our political leaders will place on the relationship with India. The involvement of the Indian diaspora in Australian politics is reflective of a broader point. The secular, liberal, democratic character of India is a key part of its attraction to Australia as a comprehensive strategic partner. Indeed, without it, our partnership would, in my view, be tepid. India is an attractive strategic partner for Australia for many reasons, but at its heart is the secular, liberal, democratic character of India. I noted earlier that the authoritarian character of China's political system is the fundamental reason why Australia does not want to see China emerge as the hegemon of the Indo-Pacific, and why it is in our interest to find ways of balancing and constraining China when it acts contrary to international norms. In this, Australia sees India as a natural partner in what is ultimately a stance based on values. If that common ground of shared values were, for whatever reason, to weaken, we would have lost the foundation stone of our strategic partnership, and no amount of realpolitik will be able to replace it. That is why the hard-earned secular liberal democratic character of India is so important to the way in which we think about the Australia-India relationship. There have been several periods in India's 75 post-independence years when its liberal democratic character has been sorely tested, most notably the period of the emergency under Indira Gandhi. Today, there are again signs that the liberal democratic character of India is under pressure. I do not share the view that India has already become an illiberal democracy, but there are indeed signs that minorities fear for their freedoms, that incitements to communal violence are met with silence, that charges of sedition are misused to advance a communal agenda, and that key institutions tasked with independence may be too accommodating of the wishes of government. These signs should not be lightly dismissed. They are not the figments of imagination of India's enemies or the government's political opponents. India's many friends are also troubled by them. But when it comes to democracy in India, I tend to the view which is often ascribed to the United States. Namely, there is nothing wrong with Indian democracy, which cannot be fixed by what is right with Indian democracy. True democracies are ultimately self-correcting, and I have long had the view that India is a true democracy. So let me conclude with these observations. When I finished my posting to India at the end of 2012, the strongest impression I had was the palpable sense of aspiration which infused its people. The India I left was a community with high and uncomplicated ambitions for a better life, young and hungry to succeed. I saw a new generation which was wide-eyed about the opportunities that they hoped lay ahead and willing to work hard to make it happen. A generation less resigned simply to accept the way things were and more determined to make something of themselves and their families. These were the sentiments that swept Mr. Modi to power in 2014. Now, aspiration is a powerful force. If thwarted, it can move in unpredictable, even dangerous directions. If fulfilled, even in modest measure, it can unleash enormous energy and achievement. And this is the challenge before India's leaders. Observers of India externally are often short-term pessimists, but there is something of the tortoise in the India I see which makes me a long-term optimist. Not for India, the sprint of the hare, but instead the steady incremental progress of the tortoise. And a key feature of incremental progress is resilience and what it brings in its wake. Sprints can peter out. Resilience comes from the hard yards of economic reform, from bringing people with you, acknowledging the incomparable value of social cohesion, recognizing that diversity is a strength, and taking into India's next 75 years that secular, liberal, and democratic character that was the singular achievement of India's first 75 years. So happy anniversary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. It's really very encouraging for us to hear you as a long-term optimist. I hope that some of that long-term optimism also translates into shorter-term, achievements. But thank you very much. You've really given us a perspective, which only a very close friend of India and someone who really believes in the future of India. It's only you who could have given us this perspective. So thank you very much indeed. We have perhaps another 15-20 minutes where you and I can have a conversation. There may be some comments or questions which will come on our website, and some of those maybe I can also post to you. But let me begin by taking up what you mentioned last in terms of the state of Indian democracy and the state of is India really sort of under strain in terms of its social cohesion and the liberalism of its democracy. I would just note that in this is of course a personal perspective, that the greatest shall I say guarantee of India not only remaining a democracy, but perhaps even flourishing as a democracy is precisely its diversity. It's very difficult to think in terms of a kind of a monochromatic political dispensation in a country which is as diverse as this. And even in some of the state elections, you do see that surfacing. So as long as it is not possible to put a monochromatic frame over this immense diversity, I believe that the self-correction of democracy that you have spoken about, I tend to believe that that self-correction will actually assert itself. So that's one point that I would like to make. You have mentioned the issue of diversity, but perhaps there is a dimension that we need to also consider as another source for the future in a sense. The second point that I would like to make is that in terms of the fundamental, nature of the economic challenge that India faces, I mean, everything else, in a sense, gets hinged on what happens with the economy. And that point is very well taken. I would only note that one of the important and positive changes that I see is, you said good economics sometimes does not translate into good politics, but I would say that perhaps quite surprisingly, I mean, we for the first time have a prime minister who is actually not inhibited about welcoming, for example, foreign capital. I can't think of any other prime minister who has been so upfront in that respect. If you see the recent trends towards, say, privatization of India's huge public sector, which is also something very controversial in India. There are observers who also talk about, how the family jewels are being sold. So in that respect, the structural reforms that you are talking about, perhaps hesitantly sometimes, perhaps not entirely comprehensively as we would hope, but it seems to me that some of those structural reforms, are being pushed. Sometimes it doesn't work, like we've found with the agricultural reforms. They were perhaps not even designed properly. They were not perhaps sold properly. But sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. That should be very familiar to you also as a democracy. Sometimes it doesn't always go in a straight line, as you mentioned. The third point I would like to make is that if the energy which has been generated by the aspirational Indian whom you have spoken about, and I think that really is a key driver of taking India to the future. The good news is that that aspirational Indian is very much there. Perhaps that level of aspiration or that hunger that you spoke about is perhaps even more than what it was before. So to the extent that this is going to be a key driver for what the trajectory that India will take in the future, this very much remains, to my mind, a very important driver. So that was just a few observations, triggered by your absolutely fantastic, lecture. The questions that I want to ask are related to two issues. One is, you mentioned that the members of the Quad may be in the same bed, but perhaps they have somewhat different dreams. Is it the case that the three, at least of the four, that is Australia, US, and Japan, perhaps have much more similar dreams, and the outlier is really India? Or do you think that this is perhaps a characteristic of all the members of the group in a sense? So is it only a matter of degree in terms of what are the different perspectives that we have, or is it really a fundamental divide between three who are allies and the fourth who's not quite an ally? That's an important way to perhaps look at what could be the future of this grouping. The second point I would like you to address is that, at least from our perspective, the Quad will actually be far more effective if it is seen in some way a kind of a core around which other kind of constellations can perhaps develop. For example, are there ways in which we can, on issues of convergent interests, work together with, say, ASEAN? And that would, in a sense, assuage some of the fear that ASEAN has. That is the Quad really, in a sense, devaluing the role of the ASEAN. Secondly, we had, until very recently, we also had the Quad inviting, for example, other stakeholders like the French, like the British, also to have some kind of an Indo-Pacific strategy. So is it worthwhile, in your view, to think in terms of not Quad as a singular and even somewhat exclusive kind of a grouping, but to really look at the way in which this grouping can reach out to a much larger constellation of actors, which I think in terms of the objectives that we have, and not only the constrainment of China, but in terms of many other things that we can do together in terms of, say, maritime security, or in terms of, resilient supply chains that we have spoken about. What are some of the other public goods that the four countries working together can provide to the region as well as globally? Is this another way of thinking about this? Because some of the tensions that you mentioned, to my mind, some of those tensions can actually be handled if we thought about the Quad in a somewhat different kind of a way. So that was one question that I wanted to ask. Perhaps I will stop here so that maybe you can respond to this, and then I would want to, of course, go to the other very important issue, which is what's happening with Ukraine and what it is doing to all of us. Yeah, Peter, you have it.
Sure. So look, I think there are a lot of big issues embedded in your question. So I don't see India as the outlier in the Quad. To my mind, the glue of the Quad is a shared interest in not wanting to see China become the hegemon of the Indo-Pacific. And I would add also the shared interests of 4 democracies. Now, why we don't want China to be the hegemon, the argument I was using, each Quad member has their own story. And so I don't think India's story is the outlier story. In fact, in some ways, I think I was arguing Australia might even be the outlier in terms of why we don't want to see China as the hegemon, because India, I don't think, is comfortable with the idea of any country being predominant power, whereas Australia, as I've said historically, has been quite relaxed if it's the right power for it to acquire predominance. I think there is something to the fact that 3 of the 4 Quad members are allies of the United States, or the United States itself, and India is not. And where I think that has an impact on the Quad is the pace at which the Quad might be able to come to a common position on the harder strategic questions. I think it's probably easier for Japan, Australia, and the US to arrive at that position than it might be for India, because India's got a much broader set of calculations to take into account. And it starts from a position of strategic autonomy and not being interested in alliance relationship. But that still leaves plenty of room for maneuver. I think there's a lot of value in a Quad plus arrangement, in other words, not making it exclusive. But I think we have to also be realistic about how that plus arrangement might be constructed. For example, I don't see any prospect of ASEAN as a grouping signing up to the Quad. I think ASEAN will always want to basically sit on its hands when it comes to a clear signal in relation to concerns about China's predominance. But that doesn't mean that individual members of ASEAN may not have a more forward-leaning view on whether they would like to be associated with the Quad. And I think there is, a case for thinking about a country like Korea, the Republic of Korea, as coming into the Quad-like arrangement. I would caution a little bit about adding too many items to the agenda of the Quad. I think the Quad needs a core discipline, which is essentially focused on the bigger strategic picture, rather than adding a whole lot of other things, all worthy issues. But if you do too much of that, I think the Quad can dissipate as an effective grouping. Where European countries fit into all of that, I think, is becoming a much more interesting question. I mean, I've always seen France and the UK as not in the first tier of strategic players in the Indo-Pacific. But what we're seeing now, both as a result of China's much more assertive position and what's occurred more recently with the Ukraine, is that where Europe fits into all of this is beginning to change. I think that will mean that the strategic link between the Indo-Pacific and Europe is going to get stronger. There was a time in the not too distant past where we were saying to the Europeans, you've got to think about the Indo-Pacific not just in economic terms. So don't just think about economic opportunity, think about what the strategic challenges in the Indo-Pacific are. And now I think that message is resonating deeply with them. So I suspect we'll have a much deeper involvement by the European powers. But at the end of the day, they are still going to be external to the Indo-Pacific. So I hope that picks up some of your.
No, that's I think a very, very credible perspective in terms of how we see the Quad evolving. From an Indian perspective, not to take this much further, but I would like to only point out that perhaps it is worthwhile not looking at the issue as a slice of history, but in a somewhat more dynamic terms. And if I see the evolution in India's role in the Quad over the last few years, in fact, there is quite a dramatic change, because if you remember, not long ago, we were not ready to raise it to beyond the joint secretary level. We were certainly not very happy about making joint statements on behalf of the Quad. Even a foreign ministers meeting was perhaps thought about a journey too far, certainly not a summit. And yet in the last few years, all of that has happened. That kind of crystallization actually has taken place from my perspective at a much faster pace than perhaps we may have envisaged even 3 years or 4 years ago. So I think we should keep that in mind in terms of what could be the likely future, because sometimes we are surprised at how things have evolved, in fact, rather more rapidly than we had anticipated.
If I may just make this one point, part of the reason why I think the Quad has moved more quickly, more recently, and India's position in particular, is that China has kind of made it a bit easier for us to do that, because its own actions has meant that the question, what is China's reaction going to be, and do we really want to, offend China in that way? I think the thresholds have dropped.
Yeah, sure. And I think in this connection, I would also like to point out that the fact that its other partner, Russia, is also allergic to the Quad has not prevented India from moving ahead with this crystallization. So that aspect perhaps is not always looked at, but I think it is also quite revealing that India has not allowed that relationship to stand in the way of its choices as far as the Quad is concerned. So that, I think, is also something we should bear in mind. This leads me, of course, to what is happening today with Europe and Ukraine. The two questions that I would like to ask you is, does this mean that a certain period in which at least the perception was of relative decline of the United States and its reluctance to play a more active role in dealing with regional and global issues, is that something which is now at an end, and we see energized perhaps the United States ready to take the hard decisions with regard to dealing with this crisis? Secondly, we have been looking at a Russia-China relationship, which has over the last several years become much stronger. The February 4 joint statement in Beijing, for example, was certainly almost like a declaration of something going even beyond alliance. That is what was in fact even mentioned by the Chinese. We now see that under strain. It is not clear to me, looking at some of the most recent, reportage from China and statements even at somewhat official level, that at least some people are thinking in terms of a little distancing away from Russia, not in fact showing the kind of solidarity that was perhaps evident in the first couple of weeks. Also, what has come out from the Rome meeting between Sullivan and Yang Jiechi in Rome would appear to suggest that there is a certain degree of caution, a certain degree of restraint in the manner in which China is reacting to the very fast evolving situation in Ukraine. But to me, this is a personal perspective. I have said in so many words that I think whatever happens in Ukraine, Russia has in fact lost. I mean, that is the reality. And what does that mean, therefore, for China and the continuance of the kind of policies that we have seen in our part of the world? Is there likely to be perhaps some correction in that respect? As someone who has been also watching China very carefully over the last several years, what is your sense of how things might change, particularly with respect to our region?
So I think on the question of US decline, I mean, I've always thought that the declinist analysis was overdone in relation to the United States, which is not to say that its margin of dominance is not going to continue to narrow. But I don't think what we've seen in terms of the US response in the Ukraine has put an end to the decline, to the concerns about American decline, or the hopeful wishes for American decline, depending on which side of this argument you're on. I mean, I think that's going to turn much more on what happens domestically in the United States, both in terms of its capacity to reestablish a degree of political consensus and on how its economy is going to fare. But it's interesting that the Biden administration has done exceptionally well in terms of marshalling allies and the international community, but it has been very careful not to commit the United States to the use of force. You could argue that Biden saying no troops very early on this might only have encouraged Putin. You can see it in the way in which the Pentagon is very reluctant to sign off on the Poles giving MiGs to the Ukraine and having them replaced by American fighters. So this is not America Redux, in my view, the handling of the Ukraine, but I think they have shown a capacity to bring Europe with them in a way that has surprised some, and it has galvanized Western Europe in a way that we haven't seen before. And it has made an immediate impact on German strategic thinking. Now, whether that will continue into the future, I think is still an open question. But clearly the Germans are in a position now where they no longer see themselves, as Gideon Haigh once said, as strategic herbivores. And they're recognizing what the consequences of the Ukraine are for security in Western Europe. On the China-Russia relationship, I mean, I think that the no limits commitments timing couldn't have been worse, actually, because no sooner had China and Russia signed off on that China found itself, backing a policy, however much it squirmed, which is clearly destined for a failure of sorts. I mean, it may not be an abject failure, but it certainly is not going to be success that Putin thought. And I would have thought China now would be trying very hard to ensure that it's not completely tarred with the Russian brush as a result of the Ukraine. And I also think that China will be quite careful not to do things vis-a-vis the Russia relationship, which could invite broader sanctions from the United States and others. I think it'll stay on the right side of that judgment. Whether it'll have an impact on China's own behavior, I think in terms of sort of China's longer term objectives in the region, its ambition for strategic predominance, its sense that the United States is declining and China is rising, that history is on its side. I don't think any of that will fundamentally change as a result of the Ukraine. It may have some impact on China's calculation about the costs of, for instance, taking action against Taiwan. Particularly it's looking at the way in which these very, very tough international financial sanctions have been implemented. China may take the view that it's 10 times bigger than the Russian economy, and so, you know, the same strategy may not work for it. But I think at the very least, it will give them pause to think about the broader international reaction. I mean, ultimately, I think what China chooses to do on Taiwan is going to turn on a judgment on its part about the American response, rather than these other factors. And there, I think the signals that the US will be sending to China will be quite different to the signal Biden sent to Russia, saying well in advance, no troops. I mean, in some ways, I think the Americans might be sending the opposite signal to China about what the consequences of moving on Taiwan are. So I think the Chinese calculation will run on a separate track at the end of the day to whatever lessons they've learned from the Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I think we have come to the end of our long debate. This has been absolutely incredible, you know, and we have learned such a great deal from you, and you know, it was really very worthwhile for us and for many of those who have been watching to really get what I would say is a very seasoned perspective from someone who has been watching this scene for a long time. This has been like a master class for all of us. So thank you very much indeed. And I would also, on behalf of Yamini and the CPR, once again convey our very deep appreciation to you for having accepted our invitation and given us really an intellectual treat this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shyam, and thank you, Yamini. And it's been a great pleasure for me to be able to participate, and a great honor for me to be invited to be part of this series. And I look forward to seeing you in person in the not too distant future.
Yes, I'm sure. Thank you. Thank you. Please take care. Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.